All you, Cindy.
Okay, can I just make sure everybody can see my screen?
It's in presentation mode right now,
Oh,
Cindy.
it is. Okay, hold on a second. I did it successfully before and then messed it up this time. Let's try this again. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you so much, sustainability folks in South Portland and Portland. I'm really happy to be joining today and great to see so many of you here. So I'm just going to jump right in. I have 3 points that I want to try to make in a very short period of time. And I'm guessing, just based on who's here, that none of this will be particularly novel news to you, but 3 quick points. So one is that we have some significant sustainability related challenges associated with all the stuff we buy, use, and toss. And I want to encourage everybody to think about it not as waste, but as stuff, right? Materials in a broader view. The second point I want to make is that there's a pretty strong building momentum on all sorts of scales, from the local to the global, to move beyond technological approaches to that problem. So we've really been focusing on how we can improve our technological approach to consumption. And then I want to focus just a little bit, and I'll cue Laura up to talk about the importance of reduction and reuse as we start to tackle these scope 3 or embodied emissions. So the first one is, and again, I don't think I'm going to be surprising any of you who would be so inclined to join this call, is that we have all sorts of ecological problems associated with materials, right? So all of the materials that we extract, produce, process, distribute, consume, and then dispose of. And so we oftentimes think about environmental problems as things like climate change or as things like acidification, but really those are just symptoms of a problem, right? The real problem is a socio-technical problem, and that has to do with overconsumption, such that the European Environmental Association's agency said that overconsumption is actually the mother of all environmental issues. So we can link it to everything from resource depletion and water pollution to carcinogens, climate change, ecotoxicity, all that good stuff. So in the United States, and in fact, in many places, people tend to associate climate specifically with energy flows, right? The idea that we are using gasoline, we are plugging in appliances, we're turning on our lights, and we think about that in terms of what we're using locally. But we also know that global materials use has increased by a factor of 8 over the past century. That's a lot, right? Increasing at a rate much faster than population. And when we break down our greenhouse gas inventories, we can cut the pie a whole bunch of different ways, right? We can think about there's this emissions pie, and we can cut it to kind of attribute responsibility in all sorts of different ways. But the EPA in 2009 took a kind of systems-based approach to our greenhouse gas emissions in the US and found that about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions are linked to materials, right? So the food that we buy, all the goods, textiles, electronics. And so that really creates this important space for policy to address consumption and issues of consumption, and not just waste, but all the way up the production chain, because we have to think about yes, there are emissions associated with waste handling and waste degradation, but there are also all of those emissions up the chain that have to do with extraction and have to do with processing, all of the energy and water that went in. And part of the reason for this is that we know that we are rapidly exceeding planetary boundaries. This is many of you have probably seen this before. This is the planetary boundaries concept from Rockstrom et al. And the Stockholm Environmental Institute. And you can see that, we're having problems with nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, but also particularly with climate change, with increasing risk over time. And I think one of the reasons that it's so important to talk about these, what we would call scope 3 emissions or indirect emissions, or what I often refer to as embodied emissions, is that there have been several studies now that look at the US relative to other nations. So Scandinavia, even African nations, Asia. And we tend as citizens of this country to have a very low level of awareness of these embodied emissions. We tend to really have this bias toward thinking about energy flows rather than the life cycle approach to thinking about this desk as something that has within it water, human labor, energy, all sorts of things. So it's important to look at those, not only for places like Portland and South Portland to get a better sense of what it is that our consumption is driving, right? What are the emissions associated with our total consumption? So that we can get a more accurate picture, but also, and I'm not going to talk much about this in this presentation, I'm happy to answer questions about it or give people references, but this is really an issue of equity and fairness on a global scale. You know, we can think about the emissions that we're driving. So 15% of trade embodied emissions are, you know, associated with US demand. That's a lot, right? And so unfortunately, carbon emissions don't know geopolitical boundaries, right? So it doesn't really matter, you know, who emits them and who's, you know, benefiting from the goods that are produced. Certainly we can improve our technologies here at home, but as long as we're increasing our consumption of goods, some of which are much more carbon intensive from other countries, we're not going to make much global progress. And that's really what counts, right? So I'm going to leave that behind now. So the dominant solution to this issue of overconsumption has for a really long time been that, okay, we're going to move towards systems thinking. We're going to think cradle to grave, right? And we're going to think about all the emissions that are associated with the goods that we buy from the time that we're extracting the metals all the way to the point where they enter an incinerator. And that's really good. But the approach has been that we're really going to focus on technological improvement. We're going to focus on making all of those systems much more efficient. So we've really focused in on a small portion of what we would call the circular economy, right? Most of our approaches have been targeted at recycling and bringing back materials and trying to loop those back into production processes. We've done a little bit of work on design, right? So things like lightweighting packaging or making it washing machines more efficient. But we haven't really focused as much on the other side of this circular economy, which I'll talk about in a second. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, there's a reason why we focused on that technology and those efficiency gains. It makes sense, right? I mean, if you think about it, it's convenient, it's inexpensive, it's basically like the low cost opportunities, the low hanging fruit. It's also really politically viable, right? It's very consistent with this idea of like market-based approaches. It's also very consistent with the very strong, like, kind of US culture of progressivism, right? That humans can innovate and solve these problems. We can build confidence and we can create a green economy. And all of this hinges on this idea. This is a little bit technical. I'll go through it fast, but all this hinges on this idea of decoupling, the idea that through technology and efficiency improvements, we can decouple economic growth from ecological harm. And there would be two ways to do that. One is that through time, we have relative decoupling where we still get increases in GDP, but and environmental pressures do increase, but at a slower rate. What we're really looking for, though, would be absolute decoupling, where GDP increases and environmental pressures actually decrease at the same time. Unfortunately, we have very little evidence that that's happening. This is really text heavy, sorry. We have very little evidence that that's happening in practice. So Tim Jackson in the UK did some emissions scenarios. So what would we need to do to kind of get to that type of efficiency improvement? So he runs these scenarios. You can see, you know, he makes some assumptions about income growth and population. You can see on the left there, the world, the UK and Japan, just for example, this is the carbon intensity of the economy. So for every dollar, this is the amount of carbon associated with each dollar. And then on the right, you can see the scenarios under different population and growth trends of where we would need to be in order to reach our carbon targets. The bottom line here is that we would need to go 10 times faster than our current rate. So we're just not moving fast enough. We'd have to have a 21-fold improvement in our current global average of carbon intensity of our economy. So it's not to say that this is impossible, certainly, but it is to say that it's going to be a really heavy lift without a lot more political and economic leadership. So if we do want to reach decoupling, though, Hubacek and his colleagues have been able to very empirically prove that it depends on reducing emissions intensity domestically, but also through import supply chains. We can't do it just domestically. It doesn't work that way. So I'm sorry that that's a bit of a Debbie Downer slide, but part of the reason for that is that even though we're seeing increased efficiency, we're seeing growth in consumption. So here are just a couple quick examples. This is a chart from the EU. the European Environment Agency. And it's just showing you number of TVs in green, the number of washing machines in orange, and the number of refrigerators in a solid gray. And you can see that the numbers of them are all increasing. At the same time, in the dotted lines, we see that the electricity consumption of each machine is decreasing. But if you look at the solid black line, the efficiency gains are being cannibalized by total growth and consumption, right? So we still see an upward trend in that black line. So yes, we're making each widget more efficient. We're doing it with better technology, but in the end, because we're making and using more widgets, we get a net increase in carbon emissions. Here's another example from a sustainability champion at Oregon DEQ, David Alloway. Some of you might have seen this before, but this also helps us to see how it can be so much more important to reduce consumption rather than take a technological approach. So this is looking at PET water bottles, and we can see global warming potential, energy use, carcinogenic potential, respiratory effects, ecotoxicity, all of these environmental bads associated with the production and use of plastic water bottles. And in blue, you can see we had a 37% recycling rate, which is not too far off what Maine is right now. We've got, all of these kind of environmental bads. If we go to a 62% recycling rate, which would be an awful lot of work, we could do it, but it would be an awful lot of work. You can see what gains we would get there in the red bars. Now, if we add in producer waste prevention, so the Nestle or Coca-Cola, they reduce the amount of plastic in each bottle, so they lightweight it. If we get a 62% recycling rate and they're lightweighted, you can see in green, we get a little more benefit in all of these environmental indices. Now, look at when people use tap water, and you see a much more significant reduction in those environmental bads, and that's the worst case. So that's tap water that's not produced in the best possible ways. And then barely visible in orange is the impact of tap water in best case scenarios. So you can see there's some real demonstrated benefits here of reduction rather than trying to take a technological approach of capturing more waste through more efficient materials processing or through lightweighting. So all of this has led to this idea that we should be focusing on sustainable consumption as a mitigation strategy, which would really look at this other half of the circular economy having to do with like retail users and systems like reuse and repair. So there has been, and this is well noted in the kind of peer-reviewed literature, there's a very strong growing recognition and movement in both policy and practice toward more sustainable consumption. And so policymakers have taken one of three strategies. The most dominant by far has been to focus on education and outreach, right? So what can we do to try to get people to consume smarter, to be cognizant of the emissions embodied in all of the stuff that we buy, use, and throw away? So again, not to be a Debbie Downer, but I'm getting to a positive point. That what we do know is that the education and outreach stuff, it's absolutely essential, but it's horribly insufficient. And part of the reason for that is that, it all is premised on the idea that you give people, rational actors, all the information and they're going to act rationally and consume green. But there are some problems with that. One is that we don't live in a free market, even though we like to tell ourselves that we do. And so we have all sorts of like barriers to that type of action. Sometimes things aren't available. Sometimes they cost more money and people can't afford that. So there are all sorts of barriers there. So the even more Debbie Downer is this idea that we can make smart choices and we would get objective gains. But there's a very sad and large empirical literature that shows that green consumers, when we are aware, interested, and engaged, tend to have carbon footprints roughly equivalent to our income, such that brown consumers, people who don't really care, don't have appreciably worse carbon footprints than people who try to live green. And the idea, finally, is that these education and outreach strategies are very individualizing. They operate as if one individual consumer in aggregate can kind of lead up to some substantial gains. And I want to just be clear here. This stuff is important and it's necessary. It's just not sufficient. That's the point I'm trying to make. We've got to go a little bit further than just education and outreach. The second strategy that has been used is regulation of choice. And there are some problems with this too, right? It's not popular. It can oftentimes be very politically precarious, such that elected officials are very, reticent to enact bans or regulations or mandates. There are also oftentimes significant regulatory hurdles to engaging consumption in this way. And we know from the social science policy space that top-down policy can oftentimes lack long-term legitimacy, and it can oftentimes, be really slow to get off the ground because it doesn't have as much public buy-in. So this leads me to a third approach, which I think is really important and very much aligned with my work and the work that Laura is doing as well. And this is the idea that we can provide support for socially embedded economies. And this is basically the idea that we should really be focusing on collective rather than individualized solutions. So rather than making the green consumers feel like they have to bear all of the burden for sustainable consumption, which oftentimes leads to burnout, right? Especially when their peers aren't matching their behaviors, we can focus on the community-based benefits of acting collectively. And there's also a large literature here. And as with all this stuff, I'm happy to provide citations and give people reading material if you want to read more about this. But the literature does suggest that there's significant value in reuse economies and the concept of collaborative consumption. So working together as communities to reduce our impacts. And I think that this is especially important here in Maine, where we have this really well-documented culture of thrift. And people refer to New England as the attic of America, and Maine as being the attic of New England, right? We have this really strong kind of culture of secondhand consumption that is, my friend and colleague, Andy Crawley, actually was able to estimate for me, look across the United States at the strength of reuse economies, and Maine is number one consistently. We're in the top. And we can think about all sorts of reasons why that might be, but I think one of the primary points is that people love it. It's a culture here, right? We can talk about economic precarity, we can talk about geographical isolation, but I think that misses the point. I realize I'm talking too long, so I'm going to just kind of skip through this last part. But we do have, so for the past 5 years, several colleagues and I have been working on measuring the value of repair and reuse economies here in Maine. And rather than go through this economic value, ecological value, and social value, I'm going to put in the chat when I'm done talking a link to our policy brief, which we published recently, that has all sorts of incredible measures of why this is a good strategy and what it can save us economically, what it can produce for us socially. So based on that, there are all sorts of different ways that local and state policymakers can address the climate impact of consumption. All sorts of ideas Portland and South Portland are already operationalizing. So kudos to you guys. I think you're, doing a really nice job here, but everything from investments in repair training and apprenticeships, which is happening all over Oregon, materials exchanges, community repair cafes. There's one in Belfast this coming weekend, I think. Sharing programs, economic incentives for repair or even reuse businesses to locate. A lot of towns are actually providing location incentives for reuse businesses. Anyway, so lots of different things that can be done, and I'm going to stop talking now and say thanks to you all for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Just as FYI, I don't think we have a chat in this one, but if you send me any info, I can send out, or Erin can send out through email as a follow-up to this event. But thank you so much for the presentation, and Laura, you can take it away, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Great, thanks guys. Cindy, that was awesome. I think my neck's gonna hurt from nodding so much. I am going to attempt to start my slides here and share my screen, but hold on a second because I also have too much open. go. Oh, it's not letting me. Hold on one second. Sorry about this, guys. Wow. Oh. Password. All right. Okay, let's see if that worked. There we go. Do you guys see the last screen, my presentation there?
Yeah, I see your presentation.
Okay. And it's on the last screen. So we got to go through all of them backwards. All right. Do you guys see reduce and reuse?
Perfect. Yep.
All right. Thank you for bearing with me. I think Zoom must have updated and taken away all my preferences to share my screen. My name is Laura Marston. I am the owner of GoGo Refill in South Portland, and I'll just give you like a 2-sentence overview of what GoGo Refill is. GoGo Refill is Maine and New England's first zero waste refill shop. Our mission is to help people who are trying to reduce their use of single-use plastic. And the way we do that is by encouraging and allowing our customers to bring containers into our store to refill instead of buying a new plastic container every time they buy something for their home or body. So we don't have food, but we have home and body products. So the best example of this is your laundry detergent container, that big, bright, very durable container that takes up half your recycling bin when it's empty. We want you to not put that in your recycling bin and instead rinse it out and bring it in to us, and we will refill it so that you don't have to buy a new plastic container every time. When you reuse a container, you are cutting its carbon emissions by half every time. So that on that premise is how we're trying to help people reduce not only the plastic going into the waste stream, but the energy associated with creating that plastic to begin with. Our motto is think big, start small, and we're on a mission to help people find the joy in low waste living. I'm just going to give you guys a brief overview of how I came to open GoGo Refill and why I did it. I was on a low waste journey myself in my home, and I had gotten to the point where I felt like I had hacked Portland, where I could do most of my shopping and most of my procuring for the house as plastic free as possible. But there was a big hole for me, and that was I couldn't get cleaning supplies, bath and body products, and also just there was no hub for a place to go and say, how do I get this plastic free? How do I reduce my waste in this area? And I had just spent so much time talking about it with friends and doing research. And one day I just said, well, I guess that's got to be me. I'm going to have to make it. So here we are. I know everybody knows that there are problems with plastic, but we really focus on single-use plastic at GoGo Refill. And I want to talk to you about the 3 things that I think are the big problems with plastic. Number 1 is pollution. And Cindy did a great job describing why it's not just the pollution we talk about as plastic getting into the ocean, but the whole life cycle from extraction to manufacturing to logistics to disposal. The whole thing is a carbon intensive process. Number 2 is recycling problems. Only a very small fraction of our plastics are recycled. And number 3 is what happens to plastics in the environment, in that they break down into microplastics and are easily consumed by animals, marine life, and humans. A big aha moment for me on my journey to low waste was realizing that we really can't recycle our way out of this problem. Only 5 to 6% of plastics are recycled in the US, and only 1% of those are recycled again. Also, plastic isn't recycled. We're kind of using the wrong word about it. Plastic is downcycled. It's not a no loss process. So when you send your plastic water bottle to the recycling facility, it doesn't turn into another plastic water bottle. It turns into another type of plastic that's less easily recyclable a second time. Whereas you have glass and metal that are recycled, fully recycled. So you look at your aluminum can, you put that in the recycling, in 30 to 60 days, it's back on the shelf as an aluminum can. Recycling is also varied and confusing. Rules differ widely by municipality. We are so lucky here in the Portland area to have Maine, a true partner, and they're really, the dedication is amazing. But it still can be confusing for what you can recycle, how it is best to be recycled. And you hear things, you know, so recycling is very very hyper local, but there's messaging about recycling that's, you know, statewide, or you see something on the news saying, oh, you can't recycle plastic anymore. But so you're getting messaging that's national or statewide, but it depends on what you can recycle at your local recycling facility. This is a slide that I like to share because there's a saying in the low waste community, and that's, if your bathtub was overflowing, you wouldn't go get a towel to wipe up the floor, you would turn off the tap. And this is an art installation by an artist named Ben Von Wong, and he does these all over the world. And it's called Turn Off the Plastic Tap. And so this is just a visualization of what we're doing. We're just allowing that plastic tap to dump plastic into the world, when really what we need to be doing is reducing our use of plastic and turning off the tap. So we must reduce in our homes, in our communities, and in our systems. I'm going to talk a little bit about ways we can do that. Cindy had slides about this, so I'll just briefly, I know we are kind of all aware of this, but we're trying to move things towards a circular economy. And that's what GoGo Refill is all about, is taking the things that are already existing in the world and reusing them, refilling them, repurposing them, repairing them, and not putting them into the waste stream at all. So what can you do at home yourself? Reducing your waste at home is a journey. I'm not going to say it's quick and easy, but I would recommend starting out by doing a waste audit, and that's how I got started. There are lots of ways to do a waste audit, so if you're interested in it, I would just do a quick Google and pick a way that's best for you. What we did was we collected our trash for a week and we just put it all over the garage floor and sorted it. Gives you a really good sense of what you're actually throwing away, because I think when we put something in the bin, it's out of our mind. So you're not actually then thinking about it. So we identified the biggest kind of areas of waste in our house, and we started picking away at how to replace those things with a biodegradable or reusable option. Number 2 is use up what you have. It's not exciting or sexy, but the least wasteful thing to use is the thing that you already own. Go slow and steady. Zero waste is an aspiration. I would like to pause here and say, like, I really don't know how I feel about the term zero waste, because I feel like it is alienating to a lot of people who think, well, I'll never be able to cut out waste completely. And I agree, it's not necessarily possible for an individual, but it is an aspiration. Set rules for yourself. So this is a big one that I rely on every day, is that I'm not great at the real-time decision-making, but if I have a bunch of, rules for myself in my head that I fall back on every time I'm making a purchase, it helps. So let's take a look at what the low waste home could look like. I broke it into 3 areas: bathroom, kitchen, cleaning. I have slides coming up about food, but there are a lot of really great solutions out there right now. There's been great innovation over the last even just 2 or 3 years for really effective and accessible products that will help reduce waste. So in the bathroom, we have a picture here of a stack of bars. There are a ton of great bar solutions now for shampoo, conditioner, face wash, shave bars, and those are really readily available if you are lucky enough to live where there is a refill shop. If not, there's a lot of stuff online. I like to say there's always the good old bar of soap. So it's interesting because you may not think of your bathroom as being a place where there's a lot of plastic, but there is a ton of plastic. If you open up your cupboards, look at the stuff you've been accumulating over the years. There are, as something runs out in your bathroom, take a look for a reusable, refillable, or bar solution for that product. If you need help finding one, please come to us. In the kitchen. So I was taking a look around my kitchen the other day, and I've been on this journey for a number of years. And I said, oh my gosh, I've done it. Here in my kitchen, for my kitchen sink, there is no more plastic associated with it. So pre-low waste journey, I would have had dish soap bottle, hand soap bottle, plastic sponge, plastic dish brush. And that's 5 things you're buying every month and then sending into the waste stream. And that's a very easy area to eliminate. You find products that work the same, cost the same, and are pretty readily available. In the picture, you can see all my dish brushes. I'm a brush girl. I think we should all have a brush for every occasion. And those are all biodegradable, easily compostable or recyclable materials, and work the same as the current dish brushes that you might have that are plastic. In terms of cleaning, we've got the same kind of thing, refillable and innovative cleaning solutions are all over the place for laundry, for home cleaning. There are lots of DIY options like cleaning with vinegar. And there are some fun new things to try out. A lot of them can be available, similar price range of what you're buying at the grocery store, and either readily available online or from your local refill shop. So bring your own, BYO. That's what I like to call the 3 most important letters in the zero waste alphabet. We all know about bringing your own grocery bags. Maine's plastic bag ban just turned 1. Happy birthday. But there are other ways to BYO in the grocery store to reduce. So there's your grocery bag, but then there are also, your produce bag. You're taking those little filmy produce bags, which are hard to recycle, and you don't need to. So in every grocery store, you can use your own reusable produce bag, little cloth bag, that you just put your produce in, and then you don't have those pesky films at the end of your shopping trip. So water bottles, Americans consume 7 million disposable water bottles a day. Not only is that a huge waste issue and emissions issue, but it's also just a waste of money. We are so lucky here to be able to have healthy, clean drinking water available. And if you bring your own water bottle, there's hardly a time when you'd need to buy one. Another example is your utensils. Plastic utensils are not recyclable, and they're likely to end up as litter. If you spend as much time picking up trash as I do, then you would know that plastic forks are prevalent in the environment. Bringing your own utensil set. It can be a cute bamboo one like you see there, or just take that wonky fork out of your drawer that nobody likes to use and stick it in your purse. And then you won't have to get a plastic fork when you get takeout. Low waste grocery shopping can be a challenge, but there are a couple things that might make it easier. So looking for items that are plastic free, that's always the best. So your local food co-op or local farms or refill shop might have package free options where you can take loose produce, refill your containers at the co-op for pantry staples. But when you're in the grocery store, you can still make better choices. So if you're looking at, in the picture, I have peanut butter, you have peanut butter in plastic or you have peanut butter in glass. Choosing the glass or the metal or the paper option is better than the plastic option. And then also make a do not buy list. This goes back to my talking about setting rules for yourself. I'll just give you an example of something that's on my do not buy list is meat at the grocery store. So the packaging for meat is not ever recyclable, or very rarely recyclable. And meat is a really high carbon food to eat. So that's one rule my family has made, is we don't buy meat at the grocery store anymore. Another thing about living low waste is composting. And it also makes your trash a lot easier to manage if you're not putting food scraps into your trash. So compost what you can. When food breaks down in the landfill, it creates methane. That's bad. And when you compost, a lot of way less methane is created, which is good. We are so lucky, again, to live in an area where we have curbside composting available. We have free compost drop-off available. So if you don't have the ability to have a pile in your yard, you don't need to. You can still easily compost. The last tip is learn how to recycle. Our South Portland has a great app and maybe Casey can send it out, but so you can see exactly what's specifically recyclable here in your municipality. So if you haven't done the tour at Maine, you should really do it. It's fascinating. You learn so much about what is recyclable, how to recycle it well, and why. And it really helps in your daily understanding of what is recyclable here. And here's a shameless plug. We are going to be hosting a how to dispose of everything workshop at GoGo Refill on July 18th with Maine. And if you're interested, you can sign up on our website, but we're going to go through recycling myths, recycling questions, and then also other things like how to dispose of other things that are tricky to dispose of. That's the last tip I'm going to leave you on, but I'm really big on inspirational quotes. I can apply all of them to the low waste journey. So I'm going to leave you with one of my favorites, which is a C.S. Lewis quote that says, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start now and change the ending." So be easy on yourself if you're trying to live low waste, and you can always make better choices tomorrow. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope that you'll take time to connect with us. And I'd love to take questions and have a good conversation. All right, thanks guys. I'm going to stop sharing.
Cool. That was really great presentations from both presenters, Cindy and Laura. So thanks again for joining us. I have a question that I'm just burning. I want to ask. So I'm going to jump in first. So Cindy, one thing I think about is I've seen some studies that show like the economic value of reuse and recycling as opposed to disposal. Have you seen studies that show how much more economic activity can be resulting from reducing waste and reusing things?
Yeah, they're really popping up all over the place now. So Minnesota did one back in 2015 that I think it got a lot of national press coverage because they were able to show that the value generated just in economic revenue for the state was greater than the entire mining industry, which is interesting, right? Because I think when I started my reuse project, a lot of the questions that I got had to do with, well, if you're really focusing on reuse, wouldn't you be damaging like first order markets? Wouldn't you be damaging production? And wouldn't you be putting people out of jobs? And it's an interesting argument, but if you look at where economic activity is generated and where it stays, the reuse and repair economy is so much more beneficial to our local communities than the kind of industrial sector, which oftentimes is far displaced, particularly today, right, in a global economy. So we, as part of our reuse project, we did do some economic estimations. They're rough, but we were able to show about $1 billion of economic activity every year in Maine associated with our reuse and repair sector, which is pretty substantial for Maine. And we did some case studies, community-based case studies. So nowhere near the size of Portland and South Portland, but up in our area near Orono, we were able to show that all of the little tiny thrift shops in that area generate over $150,000 a year in economic value for the community. And that parallels like the Parks and Rec budget for the city, but yet the city's, there hasn't been any focus on reuse, right? But it's very much in the background and doing all sorts of great things. But yeah, I'm happy to put together a list of references. So far, Minnesota, Maine, and Oregon all have some data that's available, and it's pretty darn conclusive. And then of course, like the EU and the UK RAP has lots of data there as well.
Yeah, I remember a number of years ago, I think Maine commissioned a study that was looking, at the benefits of, like, say, like waste to energy versus landfilling, and because there's more employment at a waste to energy facility and even more at the recycling facility, that on that scale, like what's the impact of one particular small organization in a small state, the economic impact was pretty significant versus throwing trash in a landfill that has very few employees versus processing waste and recycling waste with more employees. So I guess it comes down to, like, what's the discussion about economic efficiency and whose efficiency are we talking about, maybe?
Totally, yeah. And in terms of jobs and just economic activity, you can think about the more times that a toaster is repaired and moved, right? It generates these kind of multiplier effects all along the chain. And so it's, yeah, it's like, do you just burn it or bury it, or do you continue to let it generate value?
So I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to ask another question. So one thing that I encounter a lot, and just like anecdotally, I had a sander, a palm sander that I was using, and it was stopped, it wasn't working. So I brought it to a repair shop, and it cost me more to repair it than it was to buy a new one. And the guy at the repair shop is like, "Why did you even bring this to me?" And now his repair shop is closed, of course, because it's just not something that we do, and things don't seem to be made to be reused. And maybe Laura and both Cindy can kind of respond to that. How do we promote more reusable, repairable things?
Laura, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're totally right. And I think that there's, this planned obsolescence issue is real. And as Cindy had in her presentation, the right to repair legislation would be super important. And I'm not well versed on what we have here in Maine for that. I'm sure Cindy is. But you can look at the comparison, like, for example, with the EU, where there is a lot of right to repair legislation, and they have a lot more repair opportunities, I think, than we do. So that's something we need to push for sure.
Cool. Do you have anything to add on that, Cindy? Or
no, I mean, I'm a big fan of civic engagement in addition to consumer engagement. And so, we do have the Fair Repair Act at the federal level right now. So write your representatives and tell them you're in favor. I mean, I was talking with, I can't remember, it's Kyle, who runs iFixit. And he's been kind of at the forefront of this movement. And they have been able to estimate that there are like $10 billion of market capitalization associated with lobbying against the Fair Repair Act in the US. So it's going to take a lot of people. So yeah, I'll just add that. And also, I mean, there are some things emerging around product stewardship in the EU. They're not here yet, but the idea being that rather than owning your palm sander, Troy, you would contract to use one with a company, and they would be responsible for any maintenance and repairs. I'm less in favor of that because I think it kind of strips the consumer of what little power we do have. So, but I think, they're both potential options.
cool. Looks like Bill had his hand up right after I asked my last question. So.
Can you hear me? I apologize for not having my video on. I have some problems this morning. But I guess I wonder, is there any statewide legislation coming up in the next session that we can get behind in regards to this subject?
I think that there are a couple of things to say about that, not specific to legislation, but I do think we've been trying to push on the Climate Council, Maine's Climate Council, to do more materials focused work. I think they're very responsive to that, but I think the more people they hear from, that will be important. In terms of legislation, somebody may be more attuned to that than I am, but I mean, we've been trying to get together for quite some time at the state level, some reforms to our waste management system, and things like increased taxes on landfilling fees. Troy, you may know more about that than I do.
Yeah, there's been some, actually last session, there was some work that amended the fees that everybody pays for all that, haulers and cities pay for disposal. It was sort of lopsided, and landfills got kind of a free pass. And so the fees were readjusted. So now that there's these exemptions for, the DEP's fee exemptions for disposal at landfills are eliminated. So everyone's paying the same fee now, whether they go to waste to energy or ash fills or landfills, and the funds that are collected are going to go to the DEP to help support waste reduction efforts. So that was a step in the right direction. I think there's certainly more to do, and there's a lot of concern about how do we reduce the amount of out-of-state waste coming into the state, particularly through alleged processing. So in the past, a company would be able to bring in a load of like construction debris from out of state, pull 1 2x4 out of it, say that it was recycled products, and send the rest of the load to the landfill. So those are issues that are being worked on at the state level too. But there's always things to do. I think probably the biggest solid waste policy happening is the DEP working on implementing the rules for product stewardship that will ultimately require the manufacturers to help compensate the cities and towns who have to actually collect and process the waste and recycling, so that the manufacturers will have some like financial incentive to reduce the environmental impact of their products and make them more reusable and recyclable, because things that are just straight trash will cost them more than things that can be reused and recycled. So the DEP is currently working on those rules. It's going to be some time, I think, before they're done, but that Maine was actually was a leader in that field, and other states are starting to follow suit, but that's a big one.
And I would just add to the last presentation that I saw Brian Beneski give, he was talking about where the funds from that would go, and it looked very much like right now the plan is like straight back into recycling infrastructure. So that is one thing that I think, in the public comment period for that's one place we could be active, is like trying to convince the powers that be that we need to have more of that money funneled into waste reduction and reuse rather than just supporting it in infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And I just want to add to that. Usually during my presentation, I say very clearly that even though I talk about individual consumer behavior, I do not believe that we are the only people who need to make changes. And I think that there's we have to have both and solutions that are driven by consumers and also solutions that are regulated. And I forgot to say that, but it's a very important point.
Right. Do you still have a question, Ruth? You had your hand up before.
No, thanks, Troy, you got to it. I was going to ask what you thought the impact of the EPR, extended producer responsibility bill was. So you covered that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Julia, you had your hands up too.
Yeah, thanks. I always want to chime in. Such a great presentation from both of you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. I always learn something new, and I really appreciate that. And I guess what I want to say is that it's very clear that there's so many different ways that we need to really change our paradigm around consumption. And it seems like one of those things that's going to be an enormous uphill battle until we get to that tipping point. And we're starting to see those things that people are doing, even from like things like the Marie Kondo, like get rid of, like clear out your stuff. Stuff isn't the solution. But what I guess I want to ask you guys just to weigh in on is, marketing and national sort of retailers, national retailers really pull people in by the newest, coolest, latest thing, and then and spend a lot of marketing money around that. And like, how do we? I mean, I already have things written down on my sticky note to work on next. So we need to work on individual people, perhaps state legislation, and I mean, there's all sorts of views. How do we go about talking? How do we go about sort of challenging back that enormous, powerful marketing that says your answer to happiness is buying the latest, greatest, more stuff? And I wonder if you guys just have thoughts on that.
I definitely have thoughts on it. I don't know that I have an answer to the question. I think one way we can combat it is actually by having local communities that talk about reuse and that talk about the overconsumption problem. And that's one of the things we were trying to do with GoGo Refill, is create a community hub to talk about waste and our relationship to it. We get the question all the time in the store, well, is it more expensive to refill or is it more expensive to buy at the grocery store? And the first answer is we try really hard for our prices to be in line with what you're going to buy at Hannaford. But if the only thing you're going to do is change the laundry detergent that you buy, you may be paying a few cents more. But if you're actually going to look at your consumption habits through the lens, and I've done that through the lens of waste, but if you're going to look at your consumption habits and change the way you consume as all around, you're going to save a whole bunch of money. And I don't have numbers for it, but in terms of, if you're going to not go to Target, you're going to save a lot of money, even if the one item you needed at Target costs more from your local downtown store. You're not going to buy the $200 worth of other junk that you didn't need. So we have the conversations all the time. And I think, and I hope, and maybe this is just optimistic, but I hope that by having local resources for these things like GoGo and like other refill shops around and like Maine and all of the wonderful people we have doing this work here, we create trusted relationships where people can ask those questions and get the information. One thing we hear from our customers all the time is like, I'm so glad that I have somewhere to come where someone's done the research for me. Because the internet is a crazy, wild place where every company is going to tell you they have the best green solution, when we are a little bit more in tune with the greenwashing that's happening. And we have the metrics to look at the products for you. So hopefully that's part of, a small part of the solution, but it's the piece I thought I could fill.
It's great. So I guess we have time maybe for one more question, because it's almost 10 o'clock. We try to stay on time. So
Troy, sorry, it sounded like Cindy might have
to
weigh in.
Yeah.
I agree with everything Laura said. I think that it's such a big problem, right, Julie? I mean, the businesses don't want to give up their access to profit, right? And so I think it's a really large economic question of like, how do we essentially shift our economy away from like, we serve the economy, right, to the economy serving us. And I think a lot of the really promising answers are in this concept of like well-being economies. And I don't know how we operationalize them yet, but I do think that there's some evidence out there of some corporations that are moving toward that model by actually trying to kind of capitalize on the reuse trend. And so I don't think it's entirely hopeless. I just hope it doesn't require a crash first. That's what I hope.
Right.
I know there's like, you think of like Patagonia, like literally in their Freeport store, has set up a station where they'll help you repair their Patagonia products. So, I mean, that type of corporate ethic is rare and unusual, but maybe we can start seeing more of that.
Yeah, but I definitely think the local
we need
solutions.
to change our whole economic model of growth. So I'm ready. Who else is in?
Nice. Cool. You want to wrap it up, Casey?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for joining us. Cindy, Laura, thank you so much for all of your expertise. I know we're so excited to continue working with you guys in the future. And please feel free, if there's any resources you want us to share with the group and other people who signed up, we will send a follow-up email, and we will post the recording of this so everyone can rewatch and relearn all this wisdom on oneclimatefuture.org. And we're looking forward to joining you all next month. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.